I really hope you will enjoy the conference just as we did last year. I hope this will be very interesting to all of you. And I'm a very informal guy, so you can call me anything and I will just laugh at you. Ask questions, do engage with the speakers, have a lot of fun. I'm pretty sure it will be one hell of a lot of fun in here. And if somebody does something wrong or illegal, I can, I'm not allowed to do threats in the US, so I make promises instead. You will experience life without a social security number if you do something wrong. That's what I usually do back home in Norway as well. And I also wanted to tell you that we're also going to do Passwordscon in Norway again in December at University in Trondheim. So if you're interested in seeing the aurora lights and discuss password hash algorithms, then come to December in Trondheim in Norway. Other than that, I think we're pretty good actually to go. I mean, restrooms outside and you will figure out everything eventually. With that, I think we will, instead of should we do the dance?
There's no dance.
Passwords, okay.
All right.
Okay. Hashtag is passwords14. Please do give us feedback. And if somebody wants to do any selfies with any of our speakers or with me or Jeremy or anybody else, hashtag is passwordselfie. I came up with that this morning. Okay, well, we need to get serious and we need to get started. So I have the exquisite pleasure of introducing Julia Angwin. She's a former Wall Street Journal. She's with ProPublica. She have written the book Dragon Nation. Highly recommend it, and you should read it. Julia suggested we can do a quiz in like 24, 48 hours about the book. So, you have time to read it. And I said to Julia, I will introduce her at the very first non-computer technical geek ever to do a talk at Passwordscon. So please welcome Julia Angwin.
Thank you so much. I have to say, when Per said the actual words he used were, "You are going to be the first normal person to give a talk at Passwords." And I was immediately sort of flattered and offended at the same time. But I also, he was encouraging me to wear a dress made out of fabric that had all the most common passwords printed on it, which has been, the pictures of this dress have been going viral on the internet. And I decided that as a representative of normal people, I would not wear the password dress. So, it's totally an honor to be here to talk to you guys. You guys know more probably about any of the topics that I'm discussing than I do. I'm a journalist, and I come to this world as an observer and someone who's learning. And so I hope you'll bear with me as I tell you about my journey. And I think the really what I wanted to do is just tell you who I am, why am I here, and why did I start to care about passwords and privacy, and how do I feel like they fit together. So I'm going to just start a little bit with who I am. So in addition to being a normal person, I am actually not that normal. I grew up in Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, and I never touched a typewriter. I was an early digital native, as you would say. I learned programming in 5th grade. My parents were both computer programmers. And so I really saw myself as somebody who was going to go into the technology industry. I worked in my summers at Hewlett-Packard, and I was planning to go into what was then the PC industry, the booming PC industry. But I loved working on my college newspaper in journalism, so I ended up deciding to be a journalist, and I wrote about technology. So I covered the dot-com boom at the Wall Street Journal and the dot-com bust and all the exciting technology news. And in 2009, I published a book called Stealing MySpace, which was about, that long-forgotten social network, MySpace. Of course, I was right that social networking was going to be big. I was wrong that MySpace was anything anyone cared about. I had picked the wrong social network to write my book about. I should have written it about Facebook. But along the way of writing that book, I realized that the technology industry, which I had long been part of and written about, was in a different business. It was in the business of really monetizing your data. It was no longer about selling hardware or software, both of which used to be sold in stores. So when I came back to the Wall Street Journal after writing that book, I thought, I'm going to focus on this new business. And what is this whole business of buying and selling data about me? So I started this series there called What They Know. And I was basically just wanted to know, what do all these companies know about me and who are they selling it to? Of course, now I joke that if I were to do this series again, I should call it What Don't They Know, right? So, because we've learned that they know everything. But at the time, it seemed quite innovative to find out what they know. And so I started with very basics about web tracking and how the ads follow you around and cookies and JavaScript. And I really was focusing on the companies. Then I was looking at apps that send your data without you knowing it. And we wrote about how Google was blocking Apple's privacy controls with software they had embedded in ads. And then after about a year or so of doing this work, I realized that the government was heavily in this business. So we started writing about government surveillance, automatic license plate readers, which many police have installed on all their cars. And so they take a picture of every license plate as they drive by and keep them in big databases. So that anytime they want to know where you were in the past, they have a picture of your car. And we looked at facial recognition technology and how police were really excited about using that. And we ended up going into these surveillance fairs, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, where companies line up and sell their hacking tools to big governments. And so what had started as what they know 1 year, maybe one story, ended up being 3 years of investigative journalism. And yet at the same time, I still felt that people were not totally convinced that all these privacy intrusions mattered to them. At a party, people would say, well, why should I care? What can I do about it? It seems hopeless. And so I decided that I would write a book about whether there was any hope. Essentially, why should you care and what can you do about it? Was the reason I went to write this book, Dragnet Nation. And so I wanted to explore philosophically, is there a reason you should care? What kind of bad things could actually happen to me with my data being out there? And if I decide that those things are bad enough that I want to do something about it, what should I do? And so I set out on this journey in the end of 2012 and tried to figure out whether I could protect my privacy. Of course, the funny thing, and I hadn't actually thought about passwords at all, actually. I had really crappy passwords. I had all the same passwords I had had since probably my first internet account. But I was getting ready and I was learning about crypto tools and I was really excited. And before I could even start my privacy journey, my Twitter account was hacked. And basically, my Twitter account password was a 6-letter word from the dictionary. It also happened to be the same word that I used for almost every other account, embarrassingly. And this is after being a tech reporter and sort of thinking that I knew a little bit about technology. But I was hacked. It was the Labor Day weekend of 2012, and they sent out all this spam on my account. I realized at that point that I couldn't really focus on privacy without addressing security, that they were the same thing. I needed to have secure passwords. I needed to secure my data before I could worry about the government or companies taking it from me. I had to at least put a lock on the door. So this is what started my journey of thinking about passwords. So I realized that I needed to know something about the world of passwords. So I started reading all the literature. I called several people in this room who are experts for advice, and I was shocked to learn that every single thing I'd been told about passwords was wrong, right? So changing them every 3 months was a bad idea. Having to put a symbol in as some sort of symbol police at my office would insist was wrong. That not writing them down was wrong. And so I realized that in my own world that like my office required all of those things. And so my password basically had devolved to every time they sent out the reset, it would be March 2011 ? So whenever they sent it was the password I had. And then the next reset, they would send it. I would say, oh, June 2011, ! And these were absurdly hackable, as you all know. So I looked at, but it wasn't easy to figure out what was the solution. People told me about schemes I could use in my mind. If I used my spatial memory and remember objects, then I could come up with like passwords that were really long and memorable. But every time I thought about doing one of these things, I felt exhausted. And what I realized was that my mind was the greatest obstacle to setting passwords because I don't have any room in my mind for additional creativity related to password generation. So I decided to move to automation. So I ended up I used 1Password, that wasn't enough. Like, so 1Password is something that I use for most of my accounts, but I need a password for 1Password. I need a password for my computer. I need a password for my bank account and various things. So I also started using Diceware, which how many people in the room have heard of Diceware? Is everybody? Okay, not as many people as I would have thought. So Diceware is a method of coming up with long passwords. It's a dictionary, and all the words in it are numbered. And basically, you roll dice in order to pick the words out of the dictionary and string those words together as a password. And the reason you roll dice is because, of course, post-NSA and even pre-NSA, it's not a good idea to trust random number generators on the internet. So you can ensure the randomness by rolling dice. And so I had this great method. Everyone says it's very hard to break, and it's easy to remember because you have 5 dictionary words in a row. But once again, I was lazy, and so I paid my daughter to do it, to roll the dice for me. So she charged me $1 a password. She says her rates are going up though, but she would roll the dice for me and give me all these nice passwords. And actually, she started a business. So I started using her passwords, and then a bunch of my relatives were like, oh, I would like some passwords. So now my daughter, who's 9, has a password business on the side. And of course, the hilarious thing about it is it's very hard to explain to people why it's perfectly okay to buy a password, because they think you have to be super secret and that they have to think of it themselves. But in fact, as long as you add some sort of symbol somewhere in the middle of those 5 words or whatever you want to add, or capitalization, my daughter's never going to be able to figure it out. And by the way, she also doesn't care, right? She's not trying to hack into your accounts. So I still feel like this might be the plan to get college tuition paid for, is my daughter's password business. But still, I have to say, even after all of this effort and the amount of effort to which I went is basically 100 times more than any normal person would do. And even then, I would say I have a pretty failed password approach, which is I have 3 different computers. Each one of them has a 1Password file on it, and I don't sync them because I don't believe in the cloud and I don't trust it. And it's like, I have to put it in Dropbox. And so I carry this little stick and I transfer my, passwords around, and it's a complete pain in the ass. And then my husband really is annoyed because I never have my passwords with us whenever he wants to get into my Amazon account, and I can't remember. I don't know what my password is because, of course, I didn't make it. It was generated either by Diceware or by this 1Password generator. And so, and also 1Password did this analysis of my passwords, and it turns out that they're still kind of crappy because there's leftover ones that I haven't upgraded. And so, it's a really sad situation to be in, which is that, like, I have tried really hard, probably harder than anyone else, and I still have kind of probably a B- on passwords. And I have to say, as I go out and talk about my book, the one thing that gets a gasp from the audience every single time is when they ask me how long my passwords are, and I say 40 characters, and the entire audience gasps. and says, "That's not possible. I can't do it. It's too hard." Anyways, so that was the beginning of my privacy journey on passwords. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about all the rest of the journey, which didn't have to do with passwords, but I think is interesting. So right as I began trying to protect my privacy, by the way, the Edward Snowden revelations came out. And, one thing about the Snowden revelations is that they basically made me feel for the first time in my life that I had been under paranoid, right? So I actually did not think that the government was collecting every single record of every phone call made. And so it made me approach my journey with a new sense of commitment, which is that oftentimes at conferences like this, people talk about these attacks, which you just can't tell if they're theoretical or not, right? It's hard for somebody like me to assess whether these things that you guys talk about as, oh, it could be cracked in 5 minutes is actually going to be cracked in 5 minutes. And the one thing we learned from all the revelations for the past year is that every one of those theoretical attacks appears to be being deployed, right? And so there is no such thing as a theoretical attack. They are all being used by somebody. And so then that makes the privacy journey that much more important to try to accomplish. So at the same time, I'm a mother. I have 2 kids. I'm normal, as Para says. And so I really didn't want to abandon computing or my cell phone or any of these things. So I want all the fruits of the technological world. So I basically tried to do my journey is what is the best you can do to protect your privacy without giving up connection to the modern world. So the first thing I did was using Google search. So Google has a great search engine, as you all know, but they store, every search that you make. And it turns out that when you look at the history of your searches, as I did when I looked at mine, it is an incredibly revealing map of your mind, right? So my searches, which I looked at when I looked at mine, they were stored dating back to 2006 because I hadn't turned off the don't store them forever. And now, by the way, even if you turn that off, they just store them under your IP address instead of your name, which is a distinction with little difference, as you may know. So mine were dating back to 2006, and it was like every morning, it was like I would Google the weather, and then I would Google what I was eating for breakfast, and then I would Google, where I was going for my meeting and what stories I was working on. And then at 3 p.m., I would invariably sort of have some sort of Google meltdown where I was Googling like shoes I wanted to buy or something, and so it realized that this was like a very intimate, it was more intimate than a diary, right? It was actually sort of where my mind was going all day. And the idea that Google was storing it forever and they wouldn't let me have it, right? So I tried to download it, but I couldn't get it. They keep it and they could analyze it, so everyone talks about the quantified self movement, how you can learn from data about yourselves, but this is data that they're learning about me and I'm not learning about myself. And so this asymmetry means that basically they can figure out that at 3 p.m. my mind goes a little crazy and exploit that in some way. And I didn't want that. So I switched to DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine that doesn't store any data. And it's kind of a pain because it doesn't know anything about me. So when I search for Natural History Museum, and I live in New York, it gives me the one in London. But what I've realized is that actually it's not such a high price to pay for privacy to just write New York at the end. We've all gotten so lazy. We want Google to finish the sentence for us. But then I was like, I could pay this price. I could type New York. I think it won't kill me. So I still use DuckDuckGo, and I find everything that I need. Sometimes I work a little harder, and sometimes my colleagues make fun of me because it takes me a little longer. But I also feel good that I'm not contributing to this database of every single thing that I've ever thought about that will be used against me in some way, which I can't yet envision. So then after that, I focused on the social networks. So I basically felt that in today's world, I couldn't actually quit Facebook. It was sort of like it was almost like I felt like you would vanish from the earth if you didn't have an actual page. So I just, but I didn't want to be on Facebook because I feel that exposing your social network, everyone that you're friends with, and that list is basically it's impossible to make that list entirely private. So that is an incredible amount of data about you, right? We all think we're pretty unique, but in fact, our friends, they often like the same movies and the same music, and they live in the same town, and our connections reveal a lot about us. And so I basically decided that the best strategy was to unfriend everybody on Facebook. And so I went through and unfriended everyone, which was completely painful. In fact, I had to hire somebody to do it because I would see their face, and Facebook makes it very hard to kind of look at their face, and then you feel this real sadness. So I ended up paying somebody to click the unfriend button more than 600 times. And now I just have a page that says, I'm not here, I'm on Twitter. I was able to quit LinkedIn, actually, because I felt like actually that wasn't as important. So I left it altogether. I deleted my LinkedIn. My brother told me, he said, you're never going to get a job again. But I figured, we'll see, fingers crossed, right? So after that, I decided to attack my web browsing. So I wanted to be as safe as possible. So I installed HTTPS everywhere, which is basically encrypts your connection to the web so that particularly at a place like this where everyone is sniffing the Wi-Fi all the time, it's a very good idea. Although actually I've turned off all Wi-Fi in this room as a preventive measure. And then I installed some ad blocking technology, Disconnect or Ghostery, or both are good. I tried both of them. Then I took my data out of the cloud. So I took it out of the Google Cloud and put it into a Spider Oak, which is an encrypted cloud service, so that everything is encrypted even before it leaves my machine. And I had to pay for that service. That is $200 a year. So that is pricey. And 1Password also is pricey. So, the bills started to mount as I continued this journey. I didn't have as much luck actually with all the encryption. There's all these great encryption programs out there, but I couldn't get anyone to use them. So my husband refused to do encrypted email with me. He said, that's a complete pain. Why would I do that? My kids actually sort of liked it because it seemed like secret codes, so the kids like secret codes. So I convinced them to use silent text and silent phone with me, which are these encrypted apps that they could put on their iPad. And then I had to tackle commerce, which is actually really hard. So doing commerce in any sort of anonymous or de-identified way is pretty difficult. But I realized that in today's world, what you buy is almost as revealing, or probably more revealing, than your Google searches. And so I wanted the opportunity to bring some of that out of this massive database that will be mined by someone, whether it's Amazon or the government. So I actually realized that the best way for me to do that was to set up a fake identity. I would just like to point out this was legal. So I got an American Express card in another name, and it's just attached to my account so that it's as if I'm responsible for all the charges, but the card says Ida Tarbell. And Ida Tarbell is a journalist heroine of mine. She was a muckraking journalist from the turn of the century who really exposed all the monopolistic behavior of Standard Oil, which then led to its breakup. And so I felt that Ida wouldn't mind being used in this way. And in fact, her biographer actually wrote to me later and said that Ida would have been proud to be used as my alternate identity, which was, I thought, very nice. So I have a American Express card with Ida Tarbell's name on it. And then I got her an Amazon account, and a friend let me use her address. And so now Ida can order all of my books about the history of the Stasi and the history of the NSA and the history, all of the books that I feel like are going to land me on the list. Now go to Ida's account. Although I would just like to point out I'm probably on the list anyways. So at any rate, so those were my very successful strategies of, moderately successful strategies of trying to lift myself out of the dragnet. None of them would be effective if the government was actually after me in some way. And that's not my goal. My goal is not to be unfindable as a criminal. My goal is just that I don't feel that there's any reason that they should be collecting data on me until they have to. Once I become a suspect, then they should do whatever. And they should go to American Express and say, who really is Ida? And I'm sure Amex will hand me over in a hot second, I'm sure. But I just didn't feel like being surveilled at every single time that I went to a restaurant. And then, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you go to a restaurant and then you get an email the next day, like, thanks for coming. You're like, I never gave you my email address, right? So there's just too many of those weird moments where they're collecting data and using it in ways that you don't think are going to happen. In the end, though, there were two areas where I was totally unsuccessful. So one was this phone. So these things are super convenient. I love my phone and I have it with me all the time, but it is basically impossible to prevent surveillance through the phone. And the reason is because I can't install privacy software on it that monitors all the connections that it's making. So it's a black box. And so, there was a recent revelation about some hidden features in Apple that could transmit data without your knowledge. And there are many things in here that transmit data without your knowledge. The apps can be sending information. The cell phone companies, both Verizon and AT&T, have businesses where they sell their customers' location information in aggregated form. So there's really not any controls I could put on it. I experimented with a few things. I could do encrypted apps, but those were only for other people who use the same encrypted app. So there was no blanket privacy software I could put on the whole thing. So I ended up having to, first I ended up getting Ida a phone so I could have it at least in another name. But it turns out that Ida and I have very similar lives. We go to the same places and we stay at the same home. And so I realized very quickly that it was going to be pretty easy to link the two. And so then I ended up with a very sad solution of just sticking it in a bag, a Faraday cage, when I didn't want to be tracked. And that's basically a bag lined with metal that prevents any transmissions. And I really did that only to demonstrate the fact that this is a device that we have moved our computing from a computer that actually can be fairly modified to something that's very unmodifiable, and that limits our ability to prevent surveillance. The other thing that I failed at was getting my name out of all the data brokers that are out there. So I put together a list of 212 data brokers, and this is just ones I could figure out existed. And these are people who basically buy and sell mailing lists of your name, address, your likes and dislikes. Basically, they buy data from each other. So one of them has your, who's a hunter and who has a hunting license. Another one has magazine subscriptions, and they trade and build up these robust profiles of you that they sell to anyone. They sell them to law enforcement. They sell them to big companies. They sell them to individuals who, if you've ever searched for your name online, you'll see that buy your data, buy information about so-and-so for 95 cents. So all of those guys, there's no law requiring them to let you remove your data. So of the 212 that I identified, only 92 offered opt-outs. And so I opted out of the ones I could, but that means actually that the bad actors now have my data. So in some ways I actually I rewarded the bad actors because they have now data that's more scarce and so more valuable. And also, I wanted to see my data. I was desperate to see what they had on me, but I was only able to receive my files from 13 of them. And so this, again, was like just a failure of transparency across the board. This industry is not accountable to anyone, and the data is used in many, many ways. The reports I did receive were wildly varying in quality. So some of them were incredibly accurate and some were wildly inaccurate. And it just occurred to me that if nothing else, a lack of transparency is a shield for incompetence, right? So they can sell this data and nobody knows that it's totally crappy. At least if we had all access to it, we could reward the people who have better data quality. So in the end of my journey, I counted up what I had spent, and I actually had spent $2,500 in 1 year trying to protect my privacy, which is too much. And so I came away with this feeling that, I really think, if nothing else, one of the debates we should be having is this really something we want to be a luxury that only the rich can afford, or is this something that we need to try to build in some protections for everyone? And I think of it as auto safety. Cars are dangerous, but we get in them every single day. And one reason is because they have baseline safety standards, right? They have to meet certain minimums. And then you can buy your way up the chain. You can get the Volvo if you really want the full safety. But at least we all know that they have to meet this minimum. And if they don't, we can sue them, or they're going to have to go testify in Congress and pay out millions to victims and say they're really sorry. And that's just not true in the data world. You join Facebook under one set of privacy policy, and then they change it 3 months later, and there's nothing you can do. There's no baseline. They could change it tomorrow that says, like, we're selling all your data to North Korea, and, like, that's just okay. So what are you going to do? So we don't have any baseline in this world. And so then it makes it harder also for people to sell services up above it, because everyone is treated as suspect, and there's no way to prove that companies are trustworthy in this business. And so with that, I guess, I don't know what our time is, but I'd like to open it for questions. I'd be happy to talk more. Oh, I have lots of time. I talk really fast. So. Anyone? Yes?
You mentioned that
Oh, I think I have a mic we can hand out.
Oh, I don't need a mic.
Okay.
You're in Ford, Houston, Texas, in the industry, but not on Facebook, not Twitter, no public.
Uh-huh.
But they said you spent $2,500 so far. What have you spent in terms of time?
Oh, time. I mean, I spent
12 to 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, so I spent $2,500 in money, and then I spent I spent a year doing this project. Now I was writing the book, some portion of it, but I mean, I committed like maybe 6 months of my man hours to it. So that's a lot.
Did American Express require Ida to have a social security number? Because you can't get a card now unless you provide that.
No, they didn't. They asked me if Ida had a social security number, and I said no. And they said, okay, we'll send the card. And the funny thing is that American Express, I asked them later about their policies, and I have never been able to get a straight answer from them. I think that they essentially basically do offer this service because parents get cards for their kids, or they want to be responsible for their nanny's charges or whatever. This seems as though this is something they offer. As long as you're willing to take responsibility for the other named account, they apparently don't seem to have but they also don't want to advertise it. So it's sort of it's a murky situation. American Express asked me to speak. I went and spoke in front of like 150 top American Express executives, and I asked them about this policy, and they didn't answer.
They didn't throw a net over you.
No, they did not throw a net over me and turn me into the feds, which I also thought might happen. Yeah.
If I could we got Visa and then eventually MasterCards for his parents in the Czech Republic. No social security numbers.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can do this with other cards, too. I'm sort of unfairly singling out American Express. But I actually learned this technique, by the way, from a well-known cryptographer, John Callis, who said to me, because I said to him, I'm struggling with this issue of how to do commerce without always giving my identity. And he whipped out some cards with other names on them, and I was like, how'd you do that? And he told me, and that's how I got this idea.
So I'll talk to you later about syncing your 1Password data without it going to Dropbox. But in your book, sorry. The president of the ACLU, talking about stuff like this, recently said something like, the last I heard, Facebook and Google can't throw you in jail or put you on the no-fly list. So she makes a distinction between governmental surveillance and non-governmental surveillance, while in your book you kind of take a different approach, and I'd kind of like to hear why.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started this journey actually focusing on corporate surveillance. And so I came to it, I think, in a way that is actually very different. Most privacy advocates start with the government, and understandably, because the government, as you said, can throw you in jail. But I think there's a couple reasons that I think it's important to focus on both. One is that the two are so incredibly intertwined. What did we see from the Snowden revelations? We saw the government going to these companies and saying, give me this data. I have a secret court order. And then we also saw, by the way, them going and breaking into the data center. So like they get it through the front door or they get it through the back door. So part of this issue is that once it's in the hands of a corporation. The government is going to do what it can to get that data. But secondarily, there's also real harm that comes just from the corporations themselves. So some of the things that my investigative team at the Wall Street Journal wrote about was how these companies use your data against you. So I'll tell you a few examples. So we wrote about Capital One. So Capital One has a thing on their website. When you come in, they immediately check your computer, your cookies, your IP address, whatever data they can get from that automatically is transmitted, and make an instant assessment of your income and your ability to pay. And then they show you the card that they think is best for you. So we analyzed the computer traffic that went back and forth, and it literally said in the HTTP traffic, it said low income, low education. And that's how they had designated these people. And then they would show them kind of a worse card than the people who they designated as high income. And so this is basically steering. Now, you could still apply for any card you want, but you were steered towards one card. We also wrote about Staples, Staples has actually taken it a step further. So everybody who goes to Staples, and this is true to this day, I believe, gets a different price on the office supplies based on their assessment of where you live. So they look at your IP address and make an assessment of which zip code you're in, and then certain zip codes get higher prices and certain lower based on whether they're close to a competitor's store. So it makes sense from an economic perspective because if you live near an Office Max or an Office Depot, theoretically you're comparing prices and you might choose to go to those stores. But it also just happens that the people who live near those competitor stores are whiter and more higher income. So essentially people who are getting the worst prices, who are getting higher prices, are minorities and low income people. And so we have the scope of redlining can change, right? We've never had the ability to automate redlining on a massive scale, and we're just starting to see how this data will be used by corporations. And I'm just as worried about that as I am about the government, because some of these companies are bigger than governments, right? Google, for instance, when the European Union told them that their privacy policy change violated the European data protection laws, Google said, so what? Right? They don't even have to comply. Now, if you're on the ground and you're Boeing and you're making planes in Europe, you actually have to comply with the laws there. But a lot of these companies transcend the ability for enforcement. And so they're bigger than governments in some ways. And so we, I think, need to pay attention to both sides of it. And then I will give one last thing, which is that they feed on each other. So one thing that people don't realize is how much the data feeds on each other. So when you register to vote, you go to your government and they require information from you. And then many of those governments, state governments, actually sell those data to data brokers. And then those data brokers sell it back to the government in these built up reports. So they all feed on each other for all those data. Okay. Oh, I think there's one here.
Hi, two questions actually. The first is in relation to data broker opt-outs or attempted opt-outs. I wonder if you ever tried Safe Shepherd as a service to do that tracking and removal for you.
I actually did not use Safe Shepherd, but I actually used two different companies that promised to do to remove your data from data brokers.
Can you name them and say
I'm happy to name them. They're in my book. One is called Delete Me from Abine, and one was called Mail Stop Shield from Catalog Choice. And they both failed. No one would know they had failed either. So they said they'd opted me out of all these places, but because I'm an investigative journalist, I called all those places and said, was I really opted out? And it turned out that in both cases, that 50% of them, they had not opted me out. And so I actually had to go to them and say, I need a refund, and one of them shut down their business, Mail Stop Shield. I think that it's a very hard business to be in because the data brokers can make any excuse for not processing the opt-out. So I'm not sure I would blame the companies themselves. They probably did send it, although the data brokers say they didn't get it or it wasn't sent right or whatever. But in the end, these data brokers are so incentivized to do anything to make it not go through that I've learned to be skeptical of those services.
Okay. So follow-up is in relation to your alias, your IDA alias. Yeah. Is Jennifer Valentino another one?
No, Jennifer Valentino is my colleague at the Wall Street Journal. Why? Did you look up?
Okay, use your email address for your WordPress account.
Oh my God! Oh, Jennifer set up my WordPress account in the old days. Huh? That's very funny. No, I should change that. Thank you for alerting me. It's easily found.
Easily reversed from hash.
Is it?
WordPress account, so you have an unsalted MD5 hash in your public profile.
Right.
And breaking that hash reveals that email address.
Oh gosh, I feel bad for Jennifer. I've exposed her privacy just because she helped me. Okay. Yes.
I found your comment about going to the government and registering to vote and having that information go into these other systems very interesting. There was a report by WNYC a couple months back where anybody going to New York Housing Court, whether they won, lost, whether they were brought there, for their own grievances or by the landlord, no matter who showed up on these docket numbers, people were paid by national firms to sit in the clerk's office and go through the index and write everybody's name down. And these names appear on a blacklist that's used by many landlords in New York City, but also apparently throughout the rest of the country. And that's a process where you're supposed to be able to approach your government and get help from people who are, maybe taking advantage of you, whether you're the landlord or the tenant. Clearly, it's asymmetrically balanced in this situation for the landlord. So I wonder, as somebody yourself who's concerned with that kind of data wake, affecting your life and not leaving it, where would you even begin to, if you needed to go to housing court, how would you even begin to address something like this?
Right.
Like if you, needed to, like, how would you protect yourself as somebody who's trying to live this life where you're trying to cut down on that data trail? Like you've found very clever solutions to these problems so far as you've been giving the talk, and I'm wondering how far can it go?
Yeah, it can't go that far, really. I mean, the problem is that challenging the government, making a challenge in court requires you to use your real name, and that is something that courts have been struggling with for a long time, because there was always this sort of obscurity just by the virtue it was hard to go to court and look up stuff. But as things have become easier to look up, and also as there have become businesses around going and getting early access to data, you have these really unfortunate struggles where, somebody like me who's a journalist, who's really in favor of free speech and transparency, might be tempted to argue against, public exposure of those names. And yet I don't think that's the right solution. I actually don't think that clamping down and making those records secret is the right solution. I think that making it criminal to have a blacklist is the solution. Right. I know. And people say to me, like, okay, you live in some of your utopian dreamland, but I'm just saying that the fact is that's what but that's where I think you have to draw the line. And I think that, we have to that's where my Staples example comes in, which is we haven't thought enough about data usage and where we're going to draw the lines on that and restricting it.
Last question.
Great talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
You alluded to not being able to envision how your name might be used on a list or how some of the work that you do later might be used. And I suspect that you probably can envision some of the ways in which your research could land you in hot water. But more than that, in this climate, you hear a lot in the post-Snowden world about how government is clamping down on journalists, and even before that, really, whenever we found out the DOJ was tapping journalists on Capitol Hill, in your personal experience, has that world changed? Is the world of journalism different today than it was prior to Snowden? And if so, in what ways? And is it a bad thing coming for freedom of speech and for the press? What's your personal thought on that?
Yeah, I do think it's bad. I mean, what I say often is that I talk to a lot of audiences who really are skeptical. Should I care about privacy? They're not convinced. They don't care about Staples. They're convinced they won't be on the no-fly list. But the thing that I say to them, and I would say to you guys, is that the thing people should care about is freedom of the press, because we are the watchdogs of democracy. And if we can't do our jobs, then there's no one watching anymore. And the truth is, we're getting perilously close to that moment, because there is no way to have a conversation with a source in which you can assure them that they will remain anonymous. Now, if you think back to Mark Felt, Deep Throat, right? That was a secret that was kept for 30 years. Okay? Edward Snowden outed himself after 3 days because there were already police at his house in Hawaii, right? And he knew he would be caught. And in fact, I'm not sure that I can convince a source that I would ever be able to keep a 30-year secret. I don't know if I could convince him I could keep a 3-day secret. So then you're in a world of people who are willing to move to Russia. Like, that's not a lot of people. So it's a terrible time for journalists. And I have tried a million different ways to get sources to use encryption and do, but none of these tools are easy to use. And also all of them can be broken. And we know that if the NSA wanted to find you, they would. And in fact, even worse than the NSA is the fact that every single employer, no matter how rinky-dink, has the right to break all their employees' communications. And so it's very hard to convince anyone to leak. And it's been a terrible time for journalists. I think I said it to Bill Moyers. I said, we're the canary in the coal mine. We're the beginning. And I don't want to see the end of that. I want it to stop. Okay, we have time for one more? Or no, we're done. Okay, thank you.